This podcast is on interviews and focus groups in social science research. Our module learning outcomes include learning how to design an interview, describing how focus groups are conducted, understanding how scholars analyze interview and focus group data, and as always, explaining how different research designs influence the conclusions we can make. We are still in step 4, the research design phase of the scientific process. We still are determining how we will collect and analyze data related to our hypotheses. Thus, interviews and focus groups must be related to our hypothesis, and thus back to our research design. Interviews are similar to a survey. We're asking respondents questions, and we are trying to elicit responses from the respondents. However, interviews are different from a survey, especially a large N survey, in that first of all we have a small number of respondents, and small is usually maybe in the low double digits or even single digits. We want detailed information from our respondents. We want to explain in detail how the independent variable impacts the dependent variable in each case. In other words, in each of the people that we are interviewing. So we want to be very careful and fairly deep in our interviewing. Why would we use interviews? Well, an interview can provide us with a detailed impact of the independent variable on the dependent variable in the real world. We're focusing usually on a small group of people with some sort of unique characteristic. Interviews, as is often the case with the more qualitative type of research designs, have weak external validity and strong internal validity. Weak external validity means that it's hard for us to generalize from our small N interviews to a larger universe of cases. However, we have what's called strong internal validity, which is to say that we are indeed analyzing what we wish to analyze in this particular research study. So we have very much in-depth knowledge of a small number of cases. It's just hard for us to generalize beyond those small number of cases. Thus, strong internal validity and weak external validity. How do we conduct an interview? Well, we need to recruit participants or respondents first. We need to consider whether specific characteristics of the participants could affect the results of the interview. Often we want to select specific types of people, such as people who participated in an event. And that will allow us to have kind of a most similar design. If you recall from previous podcasts, the most similar systems design in comparative research. Thus, we would have people who have had similar experiences with an event. Then we'll write our questions. Questions are usually more open-ended in the interview case than they are on a survey. Researchers can follow up with questions or ask for clarification, so they're very much more open in format as opposed to the closed-ended surveys that we usually consume with large numbers of cases. For example, if we are interested in conducting an interview about immigration, we could ask the question, does your family cross the border to meet with family members? And we could have follow-up questions as well, such as how often do they cross the border? Where do they usually go? And how long are the visits? And the interviewer tries to elicit responses from the respondents. Of course, all this depends upon whether or not these questions will allow for answers. So we have to be fairly careful, especially about sensitive subjects. And immigration would be one of those sensitive subjects. We want to write our questions with several issues in mind. And these are the similar issues that we had considered in the survey research podcast from a couple of weeks back, such as the wording of the question matters. We also want to be careful that we're not framing the question so that we are expecting a certain type of response. We want to allow the interviewee, the respondent, to guide the interview. We don't want to push the interviewee into a particular response. Order of questions matters as well. We usually want to start with more general questions and then work down to more specific questions. We have to be careful. If our questions are just too complex or too abstract or too difficult to understand, then the respondent could claim lack of knowledge and not be able to respond. As with surveys, interviewees could be lying, or they could be telling white lies or shading the truth in some way, so we have to be careful about that. Interviewees could also have recall problems, especially if we're asking questions where the event in question was from many years ago. Questions could be too sensitive, as I mentioned in regard to the immigration example from the previous slide. Interviewer characteristics, gender, for instance, age, socioeconomic background of the interviewer could bias results. And if the interviews are too long or too burdensome in some way, then the interviewee might just simply want to give up and not continue with the interview. Respondent fatigue. These are all issues in terms of writing questions for interviews. The difference between interviews and surveys, again, is the in-depth aspect of interview questions. Then we have to consider what is called the interview mode. And we have three options. We can have face-to-face, or we arrange to sit down with the interviewee and ask them questions person to person. The virtue of that is that we can ask follow-up questions immediately, as in a conversation. We can read body language and take that into account in our notes about the interview. One disadvantage is that there's probably a limited pool of potential participants in a geographic area, so we might be reduced even more in terms of our case numbers. We could do the interview over the telephone, and I've done telephone interviews before. We still can ask follow-up questions immediately because we're having a conversation. However, we cannot read body language. I cannot tell if the interviewee is reacting in a negative fashion, for example, to my question. All I can do is listen to their voice. So that is a disadvantage using telephones. Online is also potential for an interview. We could have more potential participants available to be interviewed because email is relatively cheap to construct and deploy. Participants may take longer to answer questions, and that can be both an advantage and a disadvantage. They could be more expansive with their answers, but again, it depends upon their stamina and wishing to answer those questions. And in online environments, it's possible for those respondents to be delayed in their responses. Also, researchers may not be able to immediately able to ask follow-up questions in the online experience. Focus groups are, again, the same kind of idea here, the interview, but it's with a larger group of people. And not really large, probably a dozen or so would be roughly the sample size for a focus group. Usually participants share an important characteristic. So for instance, the news organization Axios has been conducting focus groups of those who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, but then voted for Joe Biden in 2020 in key swing states. And they'll have focus groups where they ask questions of these potential voters about their views about the presidential election. A focus group has focused discussion among participants. So the researcher tells participants the purpose of the discussion and sometimes asks questions, but lets participants guide the discussion and takes a lot of notes. So a focus group is more like a focused discussion more than anything else. The researcher guides or moderates the discussion. And in some respects, it's not the give and take between the interviewer or the researcher and the focus group members that elicits most interesting answers, but rather the interactions between the participants that may reveal more information than anything else. So these focus groups of Trump and then Biden voters could reveal some important information amongst the participants themselves as to what their vote choice might be in 2024. Now we have a few slides that can be seen as repetitions from previous podcasts, but I'll just remind you that if you were to conduct these types of studies as a student at Boise State University, we need to make sure that we're following proper protocols, and in particular, going before an institutional review board to make sure that no human subjects can be harmed by the potential research. So prior to the interview or focus group, respondents read and sign an informed consent form, which says that they indeed understand that this is a research study, that the harm that could come to them from participating in this study is minimal, and that they're willing to participate and can opt out of the research study at any time. And you as the researcher would keep this form for your records. Participants should be told what the study is about without any deception, who is conducting the study, and what the purpose of the study is. Participants should be told that they do not have to answer any questions and can stop participating at any point. And they should be told that the answers they provide will be treated in the strictest confidence and that all the results will be anonymous. Again, this is to reduce the likelihood of harm to any human subjects. Of course, if you were to conduct this type of study, you will likely need funding for your project. So you want to identify internal or external funding sources. Conducting research is expensive. To conduct a large-scale survey research is in the tens of thousands of dollars. To conduct an interview, to pay for your time and for the transcription of notes and so forth, this can often run into the hundreds of dollars. You should have a solid understanding of how your research will help you reach your research goals. Otherwise, you'll be wasting time. You'll want a pretest as well if you're going to conduct an interview or a focus group on a smaller group of people. You ask them to paraphrase what they think the questions are asking, if they understood the question and the potential answers, and if they wanted to ask a different option than was previously available. If the question is poorly worded and you do not pretest, and you just go simply into the field and conduct the interview or the focus group, then you could end up with bogus information and a wasted time and a potentially wasted project. When you analyze interview and focus group data, there are a couple of principles to keep in mind. First of all, what we call data reduction. We try to select the most important information and disregard irrelevant information. And this is especially true with focus groups, where there's a lot of give and take and banter that may not have much to do with your research question. You want to distill the information down to its essence. In coding, you want to identify what are called common themes among the answers of the participants and create categories for these themes. And then from that, you want to draw conclusions. Did the participants' responses indicate that the independent variable affected the dependent variable in the way that you expected? So here's an example from chapter 12. And this refers to in which direction should the EU develop itself in the future, in your opinion, specifically concerning the relationship between the central European Union institutions, member states, and regions. So for one respondent, suggesting that they're kind of an EU minimalist, for the EU is about making life easier, a little more flexible, and to realize the four freedoms that they have been dealing with for a long time now. For me, the EU should create a dynamic that makes an economic and, yes, makes sure to happen. The EU that has moved in other directions as well, and in my opinion, this has made things worse, made it more difficult, and at least at certain times made it more troublesome. If I were to decide, I would have to think of the EU goes back to the basics. Thus, this particular respondent, and all this is done verbatim, perhaps can fall into several categories. Kind of an EU minimalist, so that would have to do with their vision of the nation state, a very minimalist nation state. The EU is about making life easier, so the right trajectory of the European Union would have to do with both minimalism and making life easier. And indeed realize the four freedoms that are key to the European Union. So that falls under the box of right trajectory of the EU. The wrong trajectory would be going in the wrong direction. making things worse, not better. In deepening cooperation in official areas may have created more problems than solved. Again, that would mean the wrong trajectory of the European Union. I mean that all experience shows that the nation state, also in Europe, has come to stay. In other words, that the EU consists of nation states and is not in and of itself superseding or making irrelevant nation states. So this is how data reduction takes place in regard to respondents' response to an interviewee's question and series of questions. This is an example of data reduction. Now, there are a couple of issues with interviews and focus groups that are worth mentioning in conclusion. First of all, there could be a bias, potential bias, in the interviewer. Perhaps the interviewer is speaking in a way, a tone, or vocabulary use that does not fit well with the respondents. The respondents thus may shut down with that particular interviewer. Sometimes interviewers' socioeconomic characteristics, ethnicity, and so forth may also have an impact on the respondents. Then there's something called the Hawthorne effect, where the respondents may perceive themselves as being under observation, being watched, and thus behave in a certain fashion that they think would be pleasing to the interviewer. And if this is the case, then you might get some artificial responses to the interviewer's questions. And that is the end of this podcast.